be ready. Go ahead.
Let me start by saying thank you to you all for coming, and thank you to Christine in the History Department for hosting this event. I want to say a few things, and I made some notes because I wanted to be as short as possible to leave room for conversation, but I also wanted to make sure I hit a few things. So the first thing to say is I come at this as an artist and also as a theologian. And by theology, I don't have time to define theology the way I'm using it, but I do not mean doctrinal kinds of theology, but rather theology as a discipline that helps us understand what it means to be human beings. So I come at this as an artist and a theologian to this film and making this film. Bad theology kills. Bad theology kills. And what I mean by bad theology is demonizing other groups or classes of people, or ways that we can dehumanize others. Bad theology kills. The gift of good theology is to learn to love people we don't even like, to learn to love the other. Any authentic spiritual path is at least partly, if not mostly, that. Whether you like it or not, theology is in the public square. Theology is part of our public conversations. My aim as an artist and a public theologian is to make and to do good theology. And that is the aim of what this film, that's the aim of what this film is to be, and that I hope that it is.
Thank you for that. And I'm kind of thinking, because it's spurring some things for me of kind of what I was taking away from the film. I'm not sure, Jen, if you want to tag on that.
I was simply very grateful to have a chance to work on something, having been locked down in the pandemic. When Chris showed me his footage, I was stunned. I was really stunned at the intimacy and openness and vulnerability of the people who spoke with him about the project that they were in the midst of creating. And so that, to me, is the essence of having a really good film in the making. So I signed on.
Awesome. Thank you. And, you know, a lot of what I was taking away from the film was thinking about how and in what ways have churches chosen. I really love kind of you thinking about what makes good theology or what makes good practice of kind of Christian ideals, but also just thinking how churches have been kind of centers of resistance. A lot of resistance movements. I've been talking a lot about Reconstruction in my classes currently with my students, of churches choosing to kind of not only work to end enslavement here in the United States, but also ending it. I'm thinking of the Cuban Solidarity movement that took place in churches shortly after the ending of slavery during Reconstruction, in which, you know, Black church leaders were coming and saying, hey, we're not only going to fight for ourselves, but be allies to ending enslavement globally. Like, this can't necessarily just stay. It's not just about the fight here. It's about this global fight, and kind of being churches of resistance. I wonder if any of you have any reactions to that, of thinking about how our churches and ways, places can be sites of resistance if they choose to be.
I would just add that churches ought to be places that can be critical of power, critical of worldly power and the abuse of worldly power. Of course, that's not the only place that those critiques can come from, but faith communities ought to be able to do that.
I'd like to add that as a person who grew up with a lot of church attendance in my life, churches are a place in the public square, and they offer, if they are churches where some activism or progressive ideas take place, they offer an entry point for individuals who may concur with those ideas, but not know how to get involved on an individual basis. So they can really provide an entry point that's really awesome. And what's interesting in this film is it's about churches who did this, but it takes place in a much smaller space, the space of each individual participant who opens their heart to Chris because they know him as a pastor in their community. So like in a church, when this conversation takes place, there can be tensions, but it feels like a safe space where it is hopefully a safe space. And this is guided a lot by the leadership, a safe space where those conversations and encounters and tensions can all coexist, which I think is the crucial part of churches and that kind of space in moving us along on a conversation about race and racial misunderstanding and inequity.
For sure. I wonder, what were some of the, I know that there's a lot, one thing that's kind of evident throughout the film is of the tensions of kind of defining what does it mean to be an ally? I think if we all go back to 2020, there are a lot of different, I think, good examples and bad examples of allyship. I'm thinking of the corporate statements that were rolled out in reaction to George Floyd, you know, the kind of the false or performative examples of allyship. But this seemed to be a lot more rooted in kind of like the human experience. And so I wonder, how is this film defining allyship?
I just love the last thing you said, Daisha, about the human experience, because that's gratifying for me to hear, because that's certainly the intent, that the film is grounded there. I don't want to make any claims for the film in terms of whether it functions as an ally in racial justice work. I think that's for other people to bestow if the film it functions in that way. But in terms of the last thing you said, you know, just seeing the film again right now, I heard some other things that I hadn't heard before. They came through in a different way. And to me, listening, the words, George Floyd's words, and then Harriet talking about her quilt, and she says she was hearing all it was trying to say and what she was trying to say to the quilt. She was in conversation with the quilt. Like there was I don't know if you all remember that moment when she's talking about that. And to me, the power of words, the power of listening, this deep connection, interaction. There's something about deep listening that connects people in a very, it's going to sound trite, but it connects us in a deep way. And I feel like allyship, I mean, I know it's defined in different ways in different contexts, so I'm kind of giving my little humanistic spin on this. But when we are connected in such a deep way, in conversation, in listening, in paying attention to other people's words, there is allyship. There's solidarity, maybe would be another word that I would use there.
Yeah, and I guess go ahead.
Well, in the sense of the film, the listening piece is obviously so primary, but the secondary piece is in finding a common purpose. So these small groups, and then they called out to other churches. So that snowballed a little bit. And so finding the common purpose and provide an action or support to the action, that's where, you know, just the listening was the first most important part, but there was a purpose there. And they felt, and I think it's been shown in the exhibitions, that for other people to hear about the story and come forward to experience the quilt in the exhibition, to stand among the quilts, helps them to, experience some of that rich, empathetic kind of experience of the folks who worked at it.
For sure. And I'm really, Jenny, I'm just want to bring in my good friend JHD, just because this is something that you are very passionate about, is kind of highlighting examples of allyship. What does it mean to be ally, but also cross-racial solidarity, especially kind of thinking about that historically and contemporarily. I don't know if you want to kind of come in, JHD, and kind of discuss why is it important for us to see, kind of discuss these when we're thinking about race and equity.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way to say it is really to quote Audre Lorde about, when she said, "I'm not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own." I don't know if you could say it better than that. But in my own personal experience as a Korean American and as an Asian American, I think a lot about my childhood and how some of the things we're seeing now are sadly, repeats. And I'm not super old, I'm in my 40s. But I think back to the LA civil uprising in the early 1990s. I was a middle schooler then. And I think about Latasha Harlins, who was murdered by a Korean store owner, and that store owner did not face consequences. And Rodney King, who was beaten by white police officers, and those police officers didn't face consequences. And I think about how, my Korean American community and Black community in Los Angeles continued to be pitted against each other during that time period and afterwards. And then I fast forward to today. And I think to just January of 2023 and the mass shootings that happened in Monterey Park and Half Moon Bay and the murder of Tyree Nichols, and how people are saying, those murders were not hate crimes because they were committed by people of the same race as the victims. But what I see is white supremacy and hate and patriarchy at work there, right? And I see people in my community, in the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, fighting for our people every day, but considering the struggles of other communities of color as separate and too different. I don't agree with that mindset, because I think, going back to Lorde's quotation, that if we want to get free, then we have to do it together. And I think about how the Black community, my co-conspirators, have been fighting for my rights even before my family even came to this country, when my family immigrated about 50 years ago. And how much I've benefited, in the Asian American and Pacific Islander community has benefited from the struggles that Black leaders have undertaken and the wins that they fought for. So I know that my history is interwoven to our history. So we definitely have to do this together, right? If we're gonna fight for issues and struggles and experiences, whether they're exactly the same or not, we all are really fighting white supremacy, no matter what our race.
Yeah, and I like kind of highlighting the fact, again, kind of picking on what you were saying, Chris, and you, JHD, of kind of thinking about what is the common goal that we're all fighting for, and how can we see ourselves and kind of see each other in this fight, as we kind of consistently are kind of trying to organize against injustice in all forms, but specifically white supremacy, and also kind of think about what that looks like systemically, right? Because that's also what I'm trying to think about, is how these are entry points into a conversation about allyship. How these quilts can kind of serve as that, but also how they can kind of help keep us moving in this fight to kind of have these larger conversations about policing, as you're saying, about white supremacy. And I'm wondering, so JC, me and you do a lot with education and kind of working with youth. So I wonder, how do you think we should be talking about cross solidarity or cross racial solidarity in our classrooms and our public history spaces, as we're kind of consistently having these conversations? What is the best way to have these conversations?
I mean, I think some of the problems that we're facing with these conversations about inequities is that they are only happening in certain places, and oftentimes when it's convenient to listen, and it's not ongoing listening. And sometimes it's just about the idea of equity, but not really for the purpose of being accountable to our communities and taking action with our communities. So not in behalf of or not for them. I think decision makers in education and in other public institutions need to really get serious about being in dialogue and being listeners, especially to our community members. So to our young people, our students, our families, our teachers, people from historically excluded communities who are constantly experiencing and living with these inequities each and every day. And I know you know, because you're a teacher, you're with young people every day. You know that young people and their families and educators like you have ideas and solutions. So all of us need to listen and let these young people teach us what they need and what matters, so we can act with them, again, not on behalf of them and not for them.
For sure. And I also think of I'm also so often when people think about the past or the present, I also am thinking about how do we remember and what are the sources that we use to tell these stories? I think it's a really beautiful thing that these quilts are preserved. It's not only, this is the material culture that we talk about as historians that we want to hold on to. How do we remember what it felt like, right? Like I said, we have these statements from Target and Amazon and all these other crazy corporations talking about, what their reactions were to George Floyd, but it's really in these sources that you really get at the emotion of what it felt like to be in 2020. And I guess just to Jan and Chris, what role do you think that art plays in kind of documenting this story? What role do you think the quilts are going to play in helping us to remember not only George Floyd's life, which I think is really obvious through the emotion and the beauty and kind of looking at his last words and documenting what that experience was like, but just in general, how these quilts will kind of serve as sources for us way later in the future.
I hope the quilts go on to visit many, many more places. But in general, I am so happy that there has been a foregrounding of artists of all kinds of formerly silenced minorities. I mean, there've been all kinds of films and artworks and exhibitions that's held a richness of perspectives and just allowed, again, entry points. Because when you are sitting there looking, and what I love is not knowing the race or background of the artist, when you can just go into one of these big exhibitions and walk around and experience what people are expressing. That any type of artwork that does that opens a gateway for people to be able to enter is very helpful. And then, as you said, I think, Daisha, the people who can convene these conversations and help provide safe spaces for the conversations to go on.
We live in such a utilitarian, money-driven, be productive culture that art often gets, and the humanities get sidelined. And so, you'd go to, people can kind of shrug their shoulders and say, okay, now what are we going to do? And there is value in that because there is doing to be done. But art is a deed. Like, art makes a difference in and of itself. So this is the grand, like, we need to recover, assert loudly as we can the value of art in all its forms, to have a presence, that it is a good in and of itself, and it forms us as human beings. It forms our humanity, to get back to that. So that's my broad sense of the value of art. So here's the thing, or one thing, which I wonder about. I would love to hear other people's thoughts about this, but sometimes in our conversations about racial justice in the United States, there's this, a lot of what I've said has been talking about, let's find the common humanity. And I think that's important, but it can't be just that, because there are particular experiences that Black people have. There's a particular history to Black people in this country, for Black people in this country, that is different than what I was taught in school. So what I'm trying to express is this kind of, there's a tension. I think sometimes we try to make it a fight between the common human experience and the particular. I think they both go together. Like, we need to hold both. And I think the quilts, to tie this back to the quilts, the quilts remind us of a particularity. They're the words of anguish are universal. They're humanistic. They're the words of the agonizing words of a dying man. So there's something universal about them, but they're very, 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 very particular to this person and to a particular time and place. So I'm arguing that we need both.
And JC, were you going to come in or? I'm trying to kind of also process a little bit of kind of thinking about what does it mean to kind of talk about those particularities of really looking at, you know, the disparities that we see in terms of policing, but also thinking about that common human experience. JC, what would be your reaction to how do we navigate those conversations, particularly when we're thinking about young people of kind of, especially when we're thinking about talking about these examples in our classrooms or in our curriculums, for example?
Sorry, can you repeat the question again, please?
Oh, sorry if it came out. So I was just saying, how do we kind of picking up on that point of kind of being able to talk about the disparities, but also be able to work together on that common goal? What advice would you have or kind of thoughts do you have on how that can be reflected in our curriculums or in our educational spaces?
I mean, I think a lot of people are focusing more and more on student-centered or student-affirming education, which is great. And I think to try to do that in sort of like a color evasive way where you don't talk about race is problematic, right? We have to do it in a culturally sustaining way, and make that connection between who children are and the things that they bring, that their families taught them and that their communities taught them. So the education they get outside of the books and outside of the school building, the formalized education that we value, and we need to also value what they're coming to schools with, in ways that that truly center them and affirm them, and then use that to guide what's going on in the classroom, right? So that it's not education being done to kids, but it's what they're learning in schools connected to what they're learning in other places and how they're making sense of the world.
Deja, Trisha put something in the chat that is very, very relevant to this conversation. Trisha, do you want to add that?
Not really. I think they, Jenny made the point, and I think that's, I would just say one thing. Whether we talk about race or not, race is always talked about. It's when we choose not to talk about race, we talk about race in a way that we make race absent, and which means that it's lifting white supremacy.
Yeah, and I also was thinking about this and the fact that, although the quilts are obvious, kind of like there are these human experiences that are being reflected in the quilts, that they themselves are also not colorblind. And that you see those tensions coming out even in the documentary itself of people discussing that, hey, like there's even still these tensions and these ideas about what does solidarity mean, like that there is no kind of neutrality even in the sources themselves. So I think that's another important point. And I really thank you so much for saying that, Trisha, because that is so important to think about, right? That we have to kind of keep having these conversations, and that even if you don't, like, I remember that for me, one of the statements I kept saying in 2020 was that silence is your statement. If you are not, if you're not responding, if you're not saying anything about the moment, if you're not talking, then you are making a statement in itself. So that's something to keep in mind. I just want to pull up on some questions. I guess we can open this up just to have a conversation in our last 10 minutes if anyone wants to tag in or discuss. But Daisy, I wanted to just kind of share this question. So what about the connections with ethnic studies and oral history or youth participatory action research? Jayshi, I don't know if you wanted to tag in on that, or then I can talk about it as well.
Yeah, I think those are what was just shared in the chat about ethnic studies, oral history, youth participatory action research is like exactly what I'm talking about, right? Where we're not doing education to students and it's like a passive experience, but we're getting out of the way and letting them lead and guide their learning and actually experience learning rather than it being this passive thing that happens to them. And I think that's like applicable to all areas in school. I mean, in my dream version of education, everything would be interdisciplinary, right? Like we're talking about the arts here and how important that has to be interwoven into everything that students and adults experience, because art is like, it's healing, it's humanity. And I think it's a really important part of anti-bias, anti-racist education that often gets overlooked. But yes, to all those things that you put in the chat, like those are all part of what a good education and an education that's connected to life. All of our students deserve that, and all of us deserve that.
I agree. And I'm also just thinking, it's so interesting that you said oral history and youth participatory action research. You know, I've already said I'm a high school history teacher in addition to teaching at Southern. I teach the African American and Latinx course. And currently my students are actually working on we're doing an activism unit where they are going around and starting their work on eventually being able to interview modern day activists after kind of getting an understanding of really looking at the landscape of the 60s and 70s. And so just yesterday, my kids were walking around the classroom and looking at all of these different examples and all these different organizations, from looking at the Asian American movement, the Chicano movement, you know, the Black feminism, looking at the American Indian movement or the indigenous movement. And just being able, one of the main things that they took away were all the different examples across racial solidarity. Right. But seeing that through all of these different sources, I'm not sure if all of you were familiar, but this is something I brought to my kids, that there was a White Panther Party. And then being able to really get at what were the tensions of that? What were the issues with that? But those are all examples of getting students to really see the full story and to engage in those conversations. Because I'm also thinking that a lot of the times that we do have these conversations, we do kind of see it as kind of Black or white, and not really seeing those not only the tensions, but also the areas of collective solidarity, which we have history to kind of point to with that. Hi, Dr. Beals. So kind of thinking about, and I agree, how to kind of looking at multiple perspectives, but also again, not seeing this as just an example of collective solidarity, but also seeing those tensions within the film, I think are really important to kind of pick up on, and how solidarity isn't always easy. And allyship isn't always easy as well. I will keep opening it up for questions, but I don't know if you know, Chris or Jen, you want to pick up on this as well.
I just wanted to respond to Deja just now. Just, it's not lost on me that this is sponsored by the history department, and just the complexities that you're talking about, I think are just true to history, like the study of history, the complexities, the interactions of people with other people. And so, yes, I'm giving the amen to what you just said.
We have Dr. Metaxas. Hi. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to take a moment to share with everyone what it's like to be in a room with those quilts, because I attended the opening that we had on campus. And if there's anyone here who hasn't seen them, please, I strongly urge you to go over to see to see the quilts. When we first entered the room, well, first of all, the quilts are set up so beautifully, the lighting, the space between them and so forth. But I felt immediately that we were entering some kind of sacred space, that it was an opportunity for me to actually personally grieve as if I were in church, and reading those words, I could hear his voice. It was a connection to him that I really didn't expect, but it was so moving. Talk about experiential learning. I think it would be really important to bring as many young students to see the quilts as well, and to read those words. I mean, the words are like, it's like poetry. And there it was. And I'm not a person who follows any set religion. I'm not connected to any kind of organized religion, personally speaking, but that was a religious experience for me. It was a spiritual kind of experience for me. I just want to tell everybody to get over there. If you haven't seen them yet, please do.
Thank you so much for that. Do we have any additional questions or any kind of, I'm not sure if there are any other kind of thoughts that are also coming from the panelists that they might want to share out?
I wanted to just express how, I beg your pardon, someone had their hand up, I think, before I started speaking.
No, go right ahead, John.
Okay. That the film brought together each person who spoke regarding their experience with making the quilt was alone in a church, as a matter of fact, when they spoke with Chris about how it worked for them. In actual practice, there were tensions in these congregations, as Harriet expressed, when she had problems working on the quilt in her sanctuary, and people came up and expressed their views that were extremely hurtful to her. So the experience of being able to be in the space with the quilts as art, and the way that encountering art is a one-on-one, it's an individualized experience, is very, very important. It gets people to be able to connect and empathize, which is the main connection point we're trying to talk about. We need to have people who might wander into the exhibit of quilts who would never seek to find this documentary somewhere, and invite people into the conversation, and that's what art does, and that's why having art activities for young people as part of their, and it's an essential part of their education, is so important too.
If I may, I'll say quickly, I echo Ginny's sentiments about the space. I was not able to be there on Monday, but I when it opened on the 20th, but I took some time off this afternoon. The space felt sacred. But I want to just add on to what your comments, Jen. I think it is not young people. Every one of us needs it. Those of us who think we're allies, as I put in the chat, allyship is not a label. It's an ongoing process. We don't just achieve it. It is a lifelong journey. Mm-hmm. And white supremacy is a very successful program. It's in every one of us, whether you are white or not.
Right.
I agree. definitely on that last statement. Whether I agree with everything you just said, Trisha. And I guess I just wanted to kind of end off of thinking about what does this say, or how can these quotes or inform kind of our ideas about public history? I'm thinking of education. We talked a lot about students, but I'm also thinking about museums and how they communicate the past and communicate experiences, and how can we get our public institutions or our public history institutions to really find sources that are rooted in community. That's kind of what I'm seeing coming out of this project, of bringing not only having the community come in, but process, but also showcase their emotions, and showcase kind of their experiences in a way that I don't think oftentimes you really see coming out of museums. Most of the time, it's kind of just a summary of kind of things that have happened, as opposed to real community-based sources or experiences. And so I wonder if anyone has any thoughts on that, on what can museums in particular do to kind of showcase a lot more of this type of art?
Diversify their curatorial staff, which many of them are beginning to do, and it's leading to much richer exhibitions and more opportunities.
I agree entirely. Yeah, community-based public history. And I think there's a shared authority also there too, for people to be able to, sharing authority or sharing knowledge is a powerful experience. And I think that is a really important framework when thinking about how to do public history, in that it's supposed to be communal, it's supposed to be collaborative in a way that, I know that all of these quotes were done kind of solo and by each individual person, but it's also really a community experience as well. It's a communal, collaborative experience, and collaborative art is really powerful in how we see that. Does anyone have any last questions or thoughts that they want to share?
Hi, Daisha. To answer my first thought about where, having them shown in museums, I first of all, let me thank Chris for, the foresight to bringing this exhibit to the university campus when, as Reverend Koyama said, it had only been shown in churches before then. And so this is something phenomenal that it came to a university campus. And my sense is that these quilts need to be in public spaces, not in the museums, not objectified as something to gawk at in a museum, in public spaces where we congregate, in areas where people are passing by on the streets, public spots where they immediately pull you in. The way Ginny described the experience to me encapsulates it so beautifully. And if I could only say that an additional emotional experience that I had was its power of transformation. It immediately transformed my awareness, my consciousness, my heart, my empathy, my horror. And then it just deepened every emotion that spurred a greater, more authentic commitment to action. These quilts have the power to transform. And, to me, they are sacred art. I mean, that is the power. That is the point of sacred art, the power to transform, to pull you out of one level of consciousness and bring you to another one, one that is mystical and inclusive, unified. And these quilts do this. So Chris Petto, from my heart, thank you for bringing this experience to the Southern community. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. That's very kind of you to say.